Hi class. Today we're looking at Chapter 9, Language and Thought. It's an interesting chapter. It's interesting because of the role that language plays in our thought process. I think this chapter will challenge you in that area. It did me when I first started teaching. It's like, I never really put it all together as I looked at this particular topic. Language is defined in your text as an open and symbolic system that has rules of grammar and allows users to express abstract and distant ideas. It is open, that means it's dynamic and free. It's symbolic, that means there's no real connection between the sound and the meaning or the idea associated with it. There are different rules of grammar. There's syntax, which is a rule for arranging words and symbols in sentence, like verb, object, subject, that type of thing. Subject for object. There is grammar, which is an entire set of rules combining symbols and sounds to speak and write in a particular language. From a physiological perspective, we know that language occurs in two parts of the brain. There's Wernicke's region, which is in the temporal lobe, and that deals with our ability to comprehend speech, receptive speech. And then there's Broca's region, which is in our frontal lobe, and that deals with our ability to express speech. What is interesting too is that how speech is developed. What we find is that individuals that have had traumatic brain injuries, specifically, maybe they've had a stroke, and you're seeing left-sided or right-sided weakness. That means the left part of the brain was affected. What we're finding is that those individuals will actually end up processing language in a different area of their brain. The same part of the brain that we process singing, music. In fact, you're familiar with the Congresswoman Gabby Gifford, who was shot, and she her ability to speak was affected. That part of the brain was damaged, and so what happened was that as she was going through speech therapy, she was taught how to sing her responses. So we sing in that opposite area of the brain, which is kind of interesting. Let's see. Cooing is kind of the process. Cooing starts from 0 to 6 months of age, eventually going to babbling. This is that process. One-word utterances, single words like mom or dad, usually occur around 12 months. 18 months, we've got two-word utterances, combining words. And around 30 to 36 months, they're developing adult-like sentences. The question, as when we look at this topic, is language acquisition. Is it nature versus nurture? Language acquisition, nature versus nurture. Are we born with the ability to speak, or do we develop the ability to speak? That's really the question that occurs, that I ask my class to contemplate. And as they discuss that, I bring them an example of Jeannie. Jeannie was a modern-day feral child. You've got a video clip there illustrating her case where she was horrifically abused. She was kept in a basement, tied to a chair, kind of like a potty chair, for lack of a better term, and never was spoken to. She eventually was found by CPS. The mother was distraught and went to CPS hoping for help against her husband. And Jeannie at this time was around age 11, if I remember correctly. And she was unable to speak. And so she was raised, essentially, the state took her from her mother, and she was raised by developmental psychologists. And what was interesting is that these developmental psychologists, were trained in speech therapy. And so even though, as time progressed, she still never gained the ability, over the course of her life, she never gained the ability to have a communication like you and I do. She wasn't able to develop those nuances. She could communicate, she could say what she wanted, but she lacked the sophistication that we have. And in fact, what happens with her is she processed her speech in different areas of the brain that you or I process language. And so it kind of raises that question: are we born with ability, or are we raised to be able to acquire language? We do know that there's a sensitivity period. Conrad Lawrence, you remember we talked about him last chapter, in the learning chapter. He was the ethological psychologist who had the goslings follow him on. And what he said is that there were sensitive periods, that's for animals, critical periods for animals to learn a skill, but for humans we had sensitive periods. And the reason why there was that distinction is that there was a longer period of time for us as humans to gain a skill. Well, language ends around 12. If you've not learned the skill to speak, then you're probably never going to learn the skills to speak. There's a couple of theories that are out there about language. There is a sociocultural theory, which talks about the role of socioeconomic status and culture. And there's been a lot of research to kind of support that to a certain extent, in the fact that we see language abilities being much more developed in children that come from middle economic backgrounds and up, and less so in lower socioeconomic levels. Nothing wrong with the parents at lower socioeconomic levels. They're just working really hard, and who has time to talk with your kids? But middle income families are more verbal, they talk more, they discuss more, and up, and so those children are gaining those skills from their homes. In fact, that's why we started Head Start programs, was to give those children an advantage with them. A conditioning learning theory, shaping, reinforcing, that's one approach, although it's pretty much been discredited. Remember B.F. Skinner and positive reinforcement and punishment? That's never really held much water because there's so many nuances in language that it doesn't seem to make sense that you could reinforce all those little special nuances that are there. Another one is the nativist theory, and that is that we're just hardwired to acquire language. The language acquisition device is where we're moving towards, and it's shaped partly by parental responses. Noam Chomsky is the one who's most famous for this. Not Conrad Lawrence. Noam Chomsky. He's the one who said that we have this language acquisition device. So if you recall back a couple of chapters ago, we talked about this global workspace. That's really what this language acquisition device is. It's not one, you can't put your finger on it in the brain, but it's kind of this global workspace that brings things together. And that's where he's really gained notoriety for that. But of course, he also creates some challenge for himself right now. He's been probably the biggest critic of the Palestinian or the Israelis and their relationship with Palestinians. So that's what he's more known for, is more of his socialistic views. But that was really his fame that brought him to notoriety. So again, social learning theorists emphasize social input and stimulation. Nativists emphasize brain structure and genetic factors. Which brings us over to whether animals have language. And usually I'll ask my students, do you think that animals have language? And almost without exception, they're going to say, yes, yeah, we think so. Specifically chimpanzees, which the text talks about with Alan and Beatrice Gardner and Washoe, and whether or not he actually learned language. They have a tendency to, I think, give themselves too much of credit for this. And in fact, the chimpanzees are able to communicate, but kind of like Jeannie, they lack those nuances. They lack the ability to really develop all the nuances associated with communication. So they can't communicate. In fact, one of the Washoes, there's been several in the duration of Washoes that are out there. One of them taught an infant chimpanzee sign language. That's how they were communicating, so that was kind of cool. Let's see what else we've got in my notes here. Language, culture, and thought. This is so interesting. To me, it is interesting. When we look at language, how much does it play in our role of thinking? So language creates thought. Most people say language creates thought as much as thought creates language. That's the Whorf-Sapir hypotheses, leading to linguistic determinism hypotheses, and that is that language determines our way of thinking, our perception of the world. For example, the text highlights the Peraha tribe in the Amazon jungles, and they have no numbers beyond 2. So it's quite fascinating. How do they count 3? I mean, their IQs are just like yours or mine. They're just as intelligent, but they have no numbers beyond 2. They also don't have any numbers, anything to describe the future or the past. So can you imagine living in a culture like that? What are you going to do tomorrow? We talk about that all the time. There is no tomorrow for them. What did you do yesterday? There is no yesterday for them. They very much live in the moment today. Let's see. There's also linguistic relativism, another theory out there, and that is that most research states that language only influences our thinking. Kind of a digression from linguistic determinism. They give an example as infants exposed to vocalizations are better at learning categories as opposed to compared to listening to music. One example of this linguistic relativism is the Russian and English word for blue. There is a specific word for light blue in Russian. Golubla, I think it is. Can't recall it off the top of my head. And in America, we don't have one word for light blue. And so if you expose different colors of blue to Russians and Americans, Russians are going to be able to pick that light blue out faster than Americans are, suggesting, again, this linguistic relativism that language influences our thinking. So that's like half of the chapter. Then the second half is looking at thinking, reasoning, and decision making. And it's a fascinating topic. Cognitive psychology falls in that. That's a group of psychologists that study the science of how people think, learn, remember, and perceive. How do we represent thoughts in our mind? We've got mental representations, pictures. If I ask you which is bigger, a horse or a butterfly, you're going to picture in your mind the horse and the butterfly and say, oh, the horse is bigger. This is ways of us making our visual representation help us to understand and to recall information. There's also verbal representations, how we organize or classify our perceptions, like an animal eats, breathes, and moves. Types of animals are birds and fish, so it branches off. It's way we organize our world to make sense of it. We have these concepts. We developed a concept hierarchy. For example, a Labrador is a retriever, is a dog, is an animal, is a living thing. So we can kind of bring it up in that direction. So these are concept hierarchies that help us to make sense of things. It's also associated with parallel distributive processing, which helps us to make sense of the world. For example, if I had an object aphasia, I wasn't able to know what this word is, or what this I'm holding in my hand here. So I might touch it, and then I might taste it. And then from that, I'm bringing information from different parts of my brain together for me to understand, okay, this is a cup, and it holds water. So that's its parallel distributive processing. How do we reason about evidence? Reasoning process is drawing inferences or conclusions from principles and evidences. There's deductive reasoning, reasons from a general statement, what's known to a specific conclusion, and inductive reasoning, where we draw general conclusions from specific evidence. It's usually less certain. And the last thing I always talk about, not the last thing, but one thing I always mention in the class is critical thinking. And we talk about whether or not the earth is flat. And how do we know that the earth is flat? Again, we're looking at thinking process. Well, a lot of times they'll say, well, we see images of it, but how do you know the images aren't a doctrine? How do you know these things? And they say, well, my teachers taught me that. So do you believe everything your teachers taught you? So that's not always so good. So what I do is I use an illustration of a boat coming in to sea. When you see a boat coming in, in fact, the text has got this picture too. You're going to see the front of the boat, and before you see the back of the boat, illustrating it's going up over a curve. If it was flat, you would see the entire boat coming in. So critical thinking is the ability to analyze facts, generate organized ideas, defend opinions, make comparisons, draw inferences, evaluate arguments, and solve problems. And that's what I want you to do with your research papers. Critically evaluate it. Just because somebody wrote it doesn't mean it's true, or doesn't mean they thought about everything. So that's a key component with your research paper, that critical evaluation. The last thing I will just mention really briefly is it's Daniel Kahneman, and we'll just start with him. And I've got an interesting clip with him. He's one of two recent psychologists who have won Nobel Prizes. One was a couple of years ago. He actually won it for poetry, but still a psychologist. Got to give him credit for that. It was Daniel Kahneman. He talked about us making choices based off of irrational intuition. So we use availability heuristics. We do it all the time. When we see somebody coming up to us, we decide, are they a danger or are they safe? We make a quick conclusion using availability heuristics. And he would say that oftentimes that intuition is probably not so good. So I do want to mention him because he has got this book called Thinking Fast Thinking. So that's really, really helpful with this particular chapter. So with that said, guys, thank you very much. Appreciate you watching the video and hope that it helps as you venture into this chapter. Thank you.